All right, welcome everyone to the U Talk Election 2025 Super Show. This is an expanded version of our, yes, I am keeping that name, and this is an expanded version of what used to be our usual show before we took a short break that turned into a long break. And today we're going to be talking about roughly 6 subjects. And first off, you might be wondering something like, why should you actually care about the election? And that question should be answered right now.
Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Technically an accurate statement if you think about it. Have you heard that Australia is having an election soon? Yes, it's true. The election is on May 3rd. Yes, just a few days away. But that still gives you enough time to watch our election special. Because let's face it, that's the closest you will actually get to doing research, because you are likely not the 1% of people that actually does proper political research. That's why we did it for you. But wait, I hear you say, why care about the election? Well, glad you asked. So, you know that little thing called the Australian economy? Yeah, it has some problems. If these aren't addressed, that means poor prospects for small business, which in turn means poor employment prospects, which means you can kiss that job goodbye. Really not a good time for anyone. How is this the case, you might ask? Well, there are about 5 or so factors affecting everything right now. First, the housing and rental market, caused by property speculation in the property market by property investors, and good old-fashioned price gouging. Second is the cost of living crisis, also caused in large part by price gouging, and also high global inflation causing all money to decrease in value. The third factor is the lack of investment in regional and industry development. To be fair to the current Labour government, they are trying to fix this one, but it is a difficult one to fix. The fourth is the deteriorating global economy, a big subject which I won't get into just now. And lastly, fifth, we have the potential for the housing market to implode, which will only rip the economy into pieces. But I guess that's nothing to worry about and no reason to look into the election, right? Okay, so those are all reasons to care about the economy, but the economy is not the election. Like, obviously, right? Well, you see, government, through their actions, or inaction depending on who you vote for, will very much determine how the economy will be managed. Also, not just the economy, many other issues and aspects of society, like healthcare, education, land management, public services, foreign policy and defense. All of these and more are managed by our government, which you have a part in electing, and all of this affects you and your life. For example, you have 2 political parties. One wants to build a new rail line so that people can catch the train to work. The other wants to build new roads so that people can drive to work. If you don't have a car, then the train line benefits you most. If you do have a car, then the road might be what you want. Who you vote for provides one of these. This is a simple example, but it represents the real difference that your vote can make in an election. A real-world example of this that demonstrates the impact of your choice is the 2013 election and Australia's internet. This choice is still having an impact to this day, and that choice was voters voting for the Liberal National Government with Tony Abbott as Prime Minister, who was, at the time, promising a cheaper national broadband network. But this network was actually worse, and also ended up being more expensive in the end. This highlights something that needs some dispelling. The myth that they're all the same. You might have heard some variation of this. Maybe it was both major parties are bad, or they're all bastards, or all politicians are the same. However, as we just talked about, this narrative just isn't true. There were significant differences between their policies regarding the internet infrastructure in 2013, and there are significant differences in this election. False narratives like this are damaging because it demotivates people like you to actually learn about the candidates and their policies. It also causes you to avoid the very information that would end up disproving this narrative. This in turn leads to you voting based off vibes given by unreliable commentators rather than a real understanding, and that leads you to vote against your own interest. Would you like to have better internet? Would you prefer a new rail line instead of a road? Do you want government services and public infrastructure to meet your needs? For as long as you decide not to care about the election, you won't get any of what you want or need. As you can see, elections have a huge impact on your life, and create the future you will live through. Considering this, why would you not care about the election?
and hopefully I have produced the video which played just then, and if I have not, then I will look like a fool. And that is fine by me.
So, you said we took
So,
a short rest that kind of turned into a long rest?
yeah, remember the
Cool, I
Utilitarian
didn't
show was
ask,
supposed to take like a
how big
5-week
the
break?
room was, I said I cast Fireball.
Oh. Okay. D&D references.
I don't know, I feel like that's kind of the way the world's going at the moment. If just in case we haven't had a section on why you should care about the election. The US currently has a madman with no respect for the rule of law in charge. Germany has just very narrowly dodged Nazi boogaloo. And we have a turnip who somehow manages to look good in a suit over here. Also a former Queensland cop, but, you know, I feel the turnip thing's more evocative, who has decided that the best thing to do is do everything that's happening and not working in the US, but over here. Do you want that? I don't want that.
Yeah, me neither. That being said, though, there's also the question of why listen to us. So, let's go one by one. You know, I guess spruik yourselves. You know, James, you haven't said anything so far. Speak. Why should people listen to you?
Well, I think this election's incredibly important, and yeah, we're here to explain why. I think there's all manner of reasons why it's important that Peter Dutton does not win this election. I wouldn't trust him with a 10-foot pole on foreign policy. I think the failure of the Morrison government on foreign policy, on the economy, on climate change, on housing. Do we really want to return to that type of management? No, at least as far as I can see.
Yeah.
Okay, so, I think you've spruiked your biases. I'm going to spruik my qualifications. I am a law student and an engineering student, and for the longest damn time, my drive in life has been to fix what is broken. And that requires two things. We need to recognize what is broken. We need to have a plan in place to actually get it done. So I approach this all from the very analytical angle of how do we fix our society. Also, I don't really trust the Liberals either. I have been greatly enjoying the false narrative that they are the superior economic managers, because it's just so easy to disprove, but it is, as Goebbels said, that if you repeat a lie often enough and loudly enough, it becomes the truth. Let's not let them do that. Kyle?
So me, I've been studying politics, that is the nature of politics and political theory, public policy, political and economic history, and political media and propaganda for over 10 years now. And I've run for public office several times, local government unsuccessfully. And I write political policy on the regular, as well as a bit of philosophy, but not sure whether that's pertinent. And I'm currently, right now, writing an economic development plan for my region, as well as a documentary on political media and propaganda. So that's me in politics.
We're going to get a lot of mileage out of the Third Reich here, aren't we?
Probably. That being said, I think to spruik James for a bit, because he wasn't quite spruiking himself rather than his views.
He did what we want in politics, right? He went for the issues instead of the person. I just want to say that is an example of having integrity, even if not necessarily understanding the assignment.
True. But I would like to point out... Sorry, go on.
I don't care to sell myself here. I'm just here to basically try and stop Peter Dutton. What can I say? I mean, this man is going to be an absolute disaster if he wins this election.
I mean, he was already an absolute disaster without having won the election, so I think that providing him with additional power to mismanage is a gross abrogation of civic duty. But I digress.
Small words, Horst. Small words. Abrogation. Not even I know that
abandonment.
one.
Abandonment. That is
Okay.
that is to our civic duty. That is like leaving our wife and child behind and saying we're just going for a carton of ciggies.
Water lapping at the door.
Yes. God, I remember that one. That being said, I will also though point out, James, you are studying to be a psychologist, aren't you?
Yes, I am. So I'm doing my 4th year at the moment, so an advanced graduate diploma, pretty much an honours equivalent degree. So I've got 2 units left, so I should be done in August. Hopefully going to try and get into a master's next year. That's the plan. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've as people can see, if they have any doubts, there's some very well educated, well informed people in us with I know 2 of our IQs, so I'll say that, I expect James would be similar.
I haven't tested it any time recently, so I can't comment.
Don't make me go on the rant about why the Wechsler scales are not reliable or repeatable. Don't make me tap the sign.
I won't. But I'll say this: like the one that I took, fortunately focused on pattern recognition and problem solving, which when you once told me about one of the IQ tests that you took, which I think you said it asked about Anne Frank.
That's correct.
And it was because knowledge is not intelligence. I was very confused at that, and I didn't know that an IQ test would do that. I didn't think that would be a thing. But yeah, if I had to have my best guess about James, I'd say that his IQ would be fairly higher than average. Like,
okay.
I don't know if that registers as a really good compliment to other people, but coming from me, that's a very good compliment.
That's
I'm usually
masturbation.
Well, I'm not a simp. I'll say this: I'm not a simp for Elon Musk, so there's a start.
I hate. We've had a conversation about this previously, but remember when I was like 5 years before anyone else, I was calling him an idiot. I could rant on about that forever, but I shall refrain because we have a show to get to.
He's a great advertisement in why you shouldn't do ketamine every day.
Actually, I will say one other thing. He is a great example of how to have and maintain a personal brand.
I would say how to destroy it.
Yeah, but he still has legions of people simping for him. He has a personal brand.
He does, strong. But he's destroyed his car brand. I mean, he basically branded himself as an environmentalist.
I'm not talking about the brands like SpaceX and Tesla. I'm talking about the personal brand of Elon Musk.
James is getting into that, I think, because he was saying he branded himself as an environmentalist.
Yeah, and then he's basically completely trashed that, obviously, and become a stooge of MAGA. And right wing. Well, I know Kyle hates this term, but people who support Donald Trump don't like EVs, and now liberals absolutely hate Elon Musk. So who's going to be buying Teslas?
Probably no one. That being said, we do have some other companies that are stepping in to fill the void there. Which, as much as I'd like to talk about, we do have to get to our 6 subjects. So I will, let's see, which one do we want to do first? So we've got, Horst has put forward ideology, identity, and anti-intellectualism, as well as technical debt and political thinking, which, Horst, simple words, please. What does that mean in layman's terms?
Okay, are we starting with this?
I don't know, but,
okay.
let's start with that.
Technical debt is a concept from software engineering, so programming mostly. And it's this idea that if you build something the wrong way, you're kind of stuck with it, and you never have the time to go back and fix things, because that takes a long time. And so you can
Right.
end up being really, really badly hobbled by the decisions that you've made earlier on, and sort of get stuck working around them forever.
I've actually heard of a variant sort of for this with the games industry because I used to make video games.
Mm.
I stupidly went into like the worst and most difficult kind of coding, which was network coding, multiplayer video games coding, particularly the part that makes the multiplayer work. Um, but I digress. The concept was it was described as if you don't make something sort of flexible early on or build it in a way that allows you to do certain things early on, um, it'll be that much more difficult later because then you have to go back in and change what was described as more core coding, the coding that everything else starts to get derived from.
Yeah.
An example would be user interfaces and whether or not you could change the size of that. Simple thing, but if you don't at least code it in such a way as to allow for it early on, that then it becomes a lot more difficult later, and you have to spend many more hours doing that programming. And that's just to change the size of a user interface.
Yeah, and I sort of think of that working at the society scale, because what I think of is that, when you have a product that you're trying to ship, you're being asked for new features, you're being asked to fix these tiny little things, especially under a time crunch, and so you never have the time to go back and say, we can fix this. Like, it is perfectly technically possible to do that, at least in software, but it takes away from time that could be spent doing things that are profitable to, instead go back, shore up those foundations. And I think that that's happened with our societies, especially with regards to the duration of election cycles. It means that short-term promises are really the only ones that anyone can make.
That's kind of interesting because I was about to ask, where do you see that having happened specifically in society? You don't think 3-year terms are enough? I personally enjoy 3-year terms.
I do understand that. Obviously, we don't want to be in a situation where we have the same people running things for extended periods, especially if they demonstrate their values are out of step with society. But I sort of look at this as, okay, you know what, we're going there, we're doing this. So, there's a place called Willerowang. It used to be a coal-fired plant. They decommissioned it, though the nearby Mount Piper plant still runs. And our glorious potato-in-chief aspirant, Peter Dutton, has decided that fixing Australia's energy security issues is a matter of, peppering some nuclear fission plants around the place. And he'd love to build one on Willerowang. And you know what? I personally think that's a great idea. It is a truly amazing idea to have a nuclear power plant in 1970. There, I said it. The problem is that commissioning a power plant of that type would take between 10 and 15 years. And Dutton has what? 8? 12? Like,
they're not serious about building these nuclear power plants. It's all just a smokescreen to basically allow the fossil fuel industry to keep pumping out money and emissions. That's what it's about.
I get it, but at the same time, it's a perfect example of this problem. You cannot have a plan that requires that the government continue engaging in it for a decade or more if you cannot guarantee that the government will actually engage. And that makes it really difficult to do long-term planning. Like, let's think about setting up a desalination plant instead. That's a similar timescale, maybe 6 or 7 years to get the thing operational. If you only have one term in power, and they've broken ground but not started constructing by the time that the power flips again, that subsequent government can just say, yeah, no, we decided to go a different direction. Cannot build long term.
The Liberal Party thought that the nuclear solution was perfect for two reasons, because they're the more progressive, moderate flank. They could say, oh, we're doing something about climate change. And they thought it would neutralise that. And then, on the other end, their donors, the Gina Reinhardts of the world.
Oh yeah, uranium is still something that we
yeah,
mine out of the ground.
yeah,
It's just
they
we get it
can-
from the mining industry.
Yeah, they're good for the mining industry and also good for the fossil fuel industry because it's going to take so long to get these things off the ground. I personally, I
Yeah.
saw some statistics from, I think I can't remember if it was the Australia Institute, but it was one of these groups, and they were saying it's more likely to take 25 years for these things to start coming online, and we're looking at, and they were suggesting we're looking at trillions of dollars, not billions. You know, the Hinkley,
Yeah,
the Hinkley nuclear,
I've seen that actually.
the Hinkley power plant in the UK, one nuclear reactor, $100 billion, and that's before wastage is taken into account. So these figures that they're coming out with are a total pile of horse shit. This Angus Taylor bloke's coming out with.
Yeah, actually, on
Excellent.
that, because Friendly Geordies actually did a really good video on this, where he went through the numbers, the real numbers, and that the numbers that the Liberal Party are using, to say that they're based on very bullshit assumptions is an understatement. It assumes that the economy will get smaller in the
Yeah.
future, that the total size of the Australian economy will get smaller, and that we will need less energy overall. On top of that, Tim Buckley, I think this might be the one
That's
you're
who it
referring
was.
to.
It's Tim Buckley.
Yeah, Tim Buckley.
That's who it was.
I forget whether it was it $3 or $4.2 trillion.
Yep.
That he estimated. It was one of those that
I saw that
estimated that it
on
would.
Michael West yesterday. Yep.
Yeah, and it was one of those that he estimated it would cost, and as if trillions of dollars and it takes on average, and keep in mind this is including in its in all of its examples from which it draws an average, it's including using slave labor to build nuclear power plants, as they're doing in certain countries in the Middle East.
And
It takes an average. And the US?
Yeah. So what they do is they get folks who've been accused of they get folks who've been convicted of
In prison, yeah.
felonies.
Right. Yeah.
They have chain gangs.
Didn't know they were using them to work on nuclear plants, but I did know that they were using them
specifically
for other
nuclear
things.
plants, but they do work construction, and it
I
would
see, yeah.
absolutely be the case that they could do the basic stuff like breaking ground and the concrete
Okay.
pours and stuff.
And have a guess which states that it's in the US where this is allowed. I'll give you a clue. It's not Democrat states.
Yeah. Well,
Florida,
let's-
Texas, Wisconsin, Minnesota,
Oh, God, he's quoting them.
Pennsylvania, Michigan. No, yeah,
Pennsylvania.
Michigan,
That's not a state, is it? Oh no,
Pennsylvania. is-
Pennsylvania. Okay, yeah.
There are a number of states, and some of them are actually blue at the moment. But yeah,
A lot of them have Republican governors, though.
Yeah, that being said, to sort of get back to the point that I was making, as if it costing trillions of dollars wasn't enough, and as if, because it takes 17 years on average, including where slave labor is used to build these nuclear power plants. 17 years is the average. And all of them run significantly over budget, and no nuclear power plant in the world has ever turned a profit.
infrastructure
Yeah,
isn't meant.
private
for that.
sector won't invest in it. But also, this is a country that doesn't have a nuclear industry. Countries overseas like the UK that do have a nuclear industry, it's taking 20 years to build.
That is.
Yeah.
It's going to take us far longer because we don't have a nuclear
We
industry.
do have a nuclear industry, though. That's the thing, and it's woefully misunderstood. I drove past
Technically
ANSTO's
speaking.
headquarters yesterday.
Technically speaking, because that's not used for energy generation, it's used for isotopes for X-rays, right?
Yes and no. I'm not talking about the little synchrotrons in hospitals. I'm talking about the Lucas Heights reactor, which does actually produce energy. But also, we have a nuclear industry. The problem is that most of our nuclear industry has been dig the shit up, ship it to France, let them use it, and then for some reason which I cannot fathom, take back the spent fuel and put it in the ground again. That's the bit which confuses me.
But do we trust the Liberal Party to to go about building this. I mean, look at how badly
Of
they
course
fucked
not.
up. Look at how badly they fucked up Snowy Hydro. Look at how badly they fucked up the NBN. I mean, do we really think that these guys literally they couldn't build a canoe? Like, do we really think these
They not only could they not build a canoe, not
can
only
actually
again,
get this done in 20 years?
yeah, two things. As much as I personally don't care about language, we would like as many people to watch this as possible. So as much as it pains me to say it, let's try and keep the language as nice as possible. God, that hurt to say.
Sorry, I will try not to say that word again.
Yeah, no, that's look. Honestly, it hurts me to say because every time somebody has
It's
a problem
okay.
with
We
swearing,
get one of them for
I-
PG rating. It's fine.
I listen to too much Bill Burr. I do apologize.
well, we just popped 3, so I think we're PG-13 now. So let's try not to make it to M rating. But yeah, so
Viewer
and the
discretion is
second,
advised. This contains spicy takes on policy.
yes. The second thing there is I think when James is talking about how we don't have a nuclear industry, I think he's more talking about the sort of the regulatory framework for large scale power generation and the level of expertise needed for in as many personnel as we would need to man each of those power stations. Those alone, that's going to take years to develop. And then let's say we hit the average time frame, even though that includes power plants that were built using slave labor. That's still say 5 years to train everyone needed, 17 years to build. And that's 23 years, 22 years there.
And the private sector won't touch it.
Yeah, and the private sector won't touch it because it's a bad investment. Like renewable energy turns a profit.
Yeah, which is the irony that you got the party that claims to support the private sector and small, free markets, ends up supporting the policy that requires the most entirely government subsidies. Basically requires the taxpayer to fund it. It's just, this is the thing I just can't stand. Like these labels honestly mean nothing, really.
So this does come back to the technical debt thing a little bit because I was going to segue into this somewhere. But what you say about the taxpayer paying for subsidizing the operation of a nuclear plant, like the taxpayer also pays for and subsidizes the roads that we drive on, the hospitals that we depend on. The pharmaceutical benefits scheme, which allows low-income people to access life-saving medications, which saves money in the long term because they don't end up in hospital in acute crisis as a result of not managing their health. Infrastructure isn't meant to be something that turns a profit, and energy is meant to be infrastructure. It's something we depend on. It's not meant to be profitable. It's meant to be present. And I have this idea that, you don't just wander into a place and see, oh wow, there's a society here. Everything that we have, the roads, the hospitals, the coal-fired power plants, the electricity wiring, anyone who's played SimCity can tell you about the bloody electricity wiring. Those things, we didn't just stumble into them. We chose to build them. We undertook massive projects throughout the history of Australia to build these things and extend them. And all of the people who made the choices to engage with these civic projects were responsible for their success. And we are here now as the people who are of age to engage with civic projects. We now hold a responsibility to choose which ones we back. And because that's become politicized, it's sort of the political football. Like as you said, the nuclear plants, they're a smokescreen. As I've said, the nuclear plants would have been great in the 70s. But
so you're saying that Malcolm Turnbull shouldn't have let a private company run Snowy Hydro?
I'm saying that John Howard shouldn't have sold off Telstra. I'm saying that, oh God forbid, Dr. Hewson might have actually saved us from that particular stupidity. But yes, I'm saying that privatization is a choice, and it is a bad choice.
Well, a bad choice specifically for utilities and infrastructure and vital services. essentially, if it's a need, it needs to be publicly owned. If it's a want, then the private sector can go nuts.
The government has not historically been in the business of building systems to provide for wants. So when we look at privatization as a phenomenon, I think we sort of understand that it is the privatization of what should be public infrastructure, or what was public infrastructure.
Monopolies,
Yeah.
in my opinion, all monopolies should be government owned. They inherently, if they're privately owned, hurt the consumer.
Yep.
Yeah, and well, hey, even take like Coles and Woolworths. It's a duopoly, not a monopoly, but it's still, we're seeing price gouging, and it's hurting. It's hurting. I've got to be honest. I hate calling people a consumer, but long story there. But it's just sort of the way that we look at people. But in terms of society, like it is, and in terms of sort of the technical debt side that Horst was talking about earlier, there's a kind of opportunity cost for society there.
Yeah.
Because we are having our resources leached from us, which we could otherwise put towards other more useful things. And that starts right down at the individual level and goes all the way up to government. If we're paying more for electricity, for groceries, then we're investing less in businesses. We are investing less in very productive things, like even if it's just home renovations. That's actually creating more jobs. So price gouging and artificially inflating prices like that, like we've seen in the housing market, for example, those are essentially leaching resources from what could be other much more productive ventures.
And effectively means that these private monopolies are causing economic stagnation when we desperately need economic stimulus.
And the biggest fraud is this narrative that the conservative side of politics run, that they're with the party of small business.
Oh,
they're the party of oligopoly and monopoly.
You have just done a spot-on impersonation of Jordan Shanks impersonating a wanker there. I just want to appreciate...
These people are wankers.
We're the party of small business. I
And
don't think I can capture it.
We mean coddling Gina Reinhardt's nuts.
You're right, Horst.
Isn't it?
If you put Friendly Jordy's face over his just then, I might have actually thought that was Jordan himself speaking those words. Like,
I think the spirit of Jordan Shanks has partially possessed you, and I'm here for it.
That is wonderful.
I just despise this political party. Like, they stand for nothing. Seriously.
Yeah, but before I forget again, because I wanted to say this earlier, but then I forgot, and you just reminded me about political labels. Because
now's not the time. It really isn't. I'm gonna TLDR this, right? So, Kyle has this very, very novel approach to political labels. Left and right are a lie.
Oh, I wasn't even going to talk about that, actually.
Because
I was going to talk more about
corporate or humanist interests.
I don't agree with Kyle on this, but I understand where you're coming from.
I wasn't going to talk about left and right specifically, but rather I was going to talk about how parties are labeling themselves and sort of the impression that they're giving.
That is a good point.
Elections are increasingly sort of decided, like they're increasingly decided on vibes, essentially. And it's all branding. Like, the Greens are not really the party of the environment, despite their claims. You take a look at how they're voted in Parliament, like going right back even to Bob Brown and the days with Kevin Rudd. They voted against Rudd's emissions trading scheme, only to claim that a worse, less complex, less sophisticated, and less effective emissions trading scheme was better. And one of their chief complaints was that it only had a 5% target in Rudd's, and then they claimed theirs to be better, even though it only had a 5% target, the exact same target.
My main
even worse. Let me finish this point though. All good. So the and in terms of it being less sophisticated, what Rudd's emissions trading scheme did was it created a kind of cottage industry in decarbonizing industries. It created like essentially reducing carbon emissions. It provided an incentive, a financial incentive to actually do that. And it did that in a very market-driven way. It wasn't just the government gives you money for reducing your emissions, like Abbott pretended to do. It wasn't just that they punished you by fining you essentially for emitting more than your allocations, but rather it created a system of licenses in which if you emitted less in a year than what you're allocated, you could then sell on those licenses to people who had
carbon
emitted
credits.
more. Yeah, carbon credits. And essentially, like, we have a bastardized version of carbon credits today, but that version of carbon credits, that turned it into essentially a trading market, hence emissions trading scheme, which turned decarbonizing industries and reducing emissions into an incentive, into an industry in itself. That was very profitable, and that was really good. That's just the Greens. Like, the Liberals, they've never been the party of small businesses. You take a look at all of their actions, it benefits big business and nobody else. It benefits Eugenia Reinhardt's, your Andrew Forrests, your
Clive Palmer's.
Your Clive Palmer's.
I think the thing as well is, like, the Greens, what was achieved by blocking the ETS?
Publicity.
Nothing positive for the environment was achieved from that. All we got was basically, we got the carbon tax, which was never going to survive politically because of the damage that was done to Julia Gillard, and Abbott was always going to reverse it almost immediately. So there was nothing achieved by that. What was achieved from the Greens blocking the Housing Future Fund for 2 years?
Publicity.
All that was achieved was basically threatening Labor winning this election by basically giving Dutton the ability to try and run an election on housing. That's all that was achieved. It achieved nothing. Like, look, I would vote for the Greens because I politically probably align, in a lot of ways more with them than I do with Labor. But the fact of the matter that I get the shits with is they basically threaten long-term progressive outcomes by basically being Puritans and zealots that just want, the Roman Empire dismantled by 4:00 tomorrow afternoon, rather than a sustainable result that brings the electorate, brings business with it, and that's what drives me mad.
See, I don't even think it's that. Like, I don't even think their level of stupidity is necessarily even that. I think it's worse. I think that it's quite intentional, and sort of this is very much what I was getting.
Yeah,
with Labor, not with labels, and I genuinely believe that the Greens are essentially the Liberal Party. If the Liberal Party was successful in bullshitting everyone into thinking that they care about the environment,
I've always thought Bob Brown was actually a plant of the Liberal Party. I've always thought that. No, I don't actually think that, but it's quite funny to think about.
Bob Brown is a CIA shill confirmed.
I don't actually think that, but in practice, that's how he's basically operated. He's pretty much served the far right.
Okay, and what about like the present day, where we have, is Di Natale still in charge of the Greens nominally?
No, it's Bant, Adam Bant now.
Adam Bant. Oh, okay. I don't hate Adam Bant's politics. I'll just say that.
I used to kind of like Adam Bant until he opened his mouth. That was when it all went south.
I don't mind his policy on negative gearing, I must admit. But to be honest, I understand why Labor can't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, I mean, they took it to an election. Hell, they took phasing it out over something like 30 years to an election, and they lost based on that and franking credits, which was like the most stupid issue to lose an election on, because it affects literally like 1% of the population, and almost all of them are super rich.
Okay, so I'm going to...
Sean should never have run that policy. It was such a bad idea. I mean, it was a good policy, but it was a bad idea politically. That was the problem going into an election. It opened him up to attack from Morrison with a scare campaign.
I think the problem isn't necessarily even the policy or even taking that to an election. I think Paul Keating has it right here, and this is I think where the major parties where the Labour Party's major weakness is.
We get it. You're a little bit gay for
Is that-
heating. Go on.
Who isn't?
I know, right?
I mean, he
Man can get it.
he did build modern Australia.
He did
He's
offer
the greatest,
me
like-
slowly, personally.
I love when some Sky News reporter asked him some question about the dangers of China and how does he know that this isn't going to be a massive problem, and he just responds, "Because I have a brain." We need more politicians like that who just treat these people with contempt. Like, you know,
that's part of what I'm getting at, because what he did, because he is a very intelligent man, and he basically pointed out, very charismatic, and he pointed out what he did is he made good policy good politics. Essentially, he found a way to make the good policy look good to everyone. He found a way, well, essentially to rip apart, any shitty journalist that tried to ask them a bullshit question. And I think the problem is that Labour are just, not only are they, it's not necessarily even that they're incapable. It's because we've seen it happen with dictator Dan down in Victoria when he was premier, or Danistan as it was known back then.
So I visited the province of Dictator Dan when I was down there, and I've got to say, word on the street wasn't actually that Dictator Dan was Dictator Dan. People were mostly happy.
Yeah,
I love the conspiracy theory about how he had the back injury. Have you read it? Like
back, he slipped down the stairs and broke his back. Yeah, was. Yeah,
but the conspiracy theory is that he was like hitting on some like 17-year-old girl and like got the living shit beaten out of him by the father or the uncle, I can't remember, and basically like almost
where did that start?
These like trumpeter patriot type One Nation type characters believe this conspiracy theory that he was just
on what basis though?
Look. If he did and that happened, I cannot in good conscience advocate for vigilante justice, but I'm also a country kid, and that's what happens when you hit on 17-year-olds.
It didn't. I guarantee. Certainly.
Oh yeah, it did.
Yeah, I don't actually believe. I don't know the man's moral compass to that extent, but on the basis of what I do know, I'm relatively confident that Dan Andrews, even if for whatever reason he had some desire to, I'm firmly confident that he knows better than to cross that moral line. I am confident that he has good character, and if that questionable spark exists, if nothing else, good discipline.
I honestly think if he was in this call now, we'd be having a good time talking to him. Like I think he's quite a bit like us, unafraid of the media, very much about good policy, and I think in a weird way I kind of relate to him, because whenever I saw him get a bullshit question, he'd do the exact same thing that I do, where he'd get confused for a second, and then he'd work out, oh, this is a bullshit question, and then he'd rip it apart. And so
it seemed like he was having fun as well. Like, some of his one-liners,
same as Paul Keating,
was brilliant. Like, what was that one where they're like,
"Do
you think it's time?
Larrikin again?
Do you think it's time to get on the beers?" And he's like, "Yeah, I think it is."
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. I just found that
yeah. All right, so we've been getting way. I mean, I don't even know if what we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes was even one of our subjects.
It is. We've sort of ended up meandering through this concept of technical debt anyway, because we've sort of hit most of the points too.
Look, let's be honest. The aim of this podcast was to shit on the LNP 24/7.
No, the aim of this podcast was to improve civic engagement, to make people understand why it was important that they vote, and important to think about how they vote. And if we make them think by shitting on the LNP, that's just bonus.
So I think we have three aims here, because that's Horst's aim.
That's my aim.
James' aim is to shit on the LNP, and my aim is to give people useful information for when they vote on polling day coming this Saturday. 3rd of May. Don't miss your chance to vote. It's important.
I take it
Don't
you'll
miss
vote.
out
You
on the
voted for Trump
democracy
and a
sausage.
patriot.
It's un-Australian.
Yes,
I
get your
take it.
sausage.
I take it you both voted for Trump and Patriots, right?
Oh, of course, of course. You know, why would we not?
Oh, good grief! No,
You know,
I personally believe that a vote for one nation is a vote for the nation.
I
yeah.
have been convinced by the text messages I've been receiving from Clive Palmer. I think he has the best interest of this nation at heart. I'm honestly convinced. I think he's
Oh, of course.
going to change everything.
I am enjoying the billboard for Trumpet of Patriots with that blonde broad who's just like leader of Trumpet of Patriots and future
Who is
Prime
she?
Minister. I admire her confidence. I admire her. She is manifesting that shit into the world.
And I especially enjoyed that one time that Clive Palmer tried to move his flagship company to, I think, New Zealand in order to take advantage of a legal loophole, which he would then use to sue Australia for, I think it was $43 billion.
What an enterprising man! I'm sure nothing could possibly go wrong with him greasing the gears.
You know what?
Exactly.
A bit of a olive branch to the right. I will give them this. Hardline conservatives, I have a little bit of respect for the fact that they vote for Pauline over Clive, because as much as I can't stand either of them. I get the impression Pauline actually believes more of what she's saying, rather.
Hanson is a woman of principles.
Yeah,
they're not the same principles as me, but she does have principles.
I mean,
Clive is so obviously a fraud.
I'm not going to entirely disagree with you with Pauline Hanson, but I'm not going to entirely agree with you either, because I've seen times.
Let me reframe it. She's obviously less of a grifter and less of a fraud than Clive.
Low bar, but
that's probably a better way of framing it.
I mean, yeah, you said low bar. I don't know how far down to put that bar. Like, do I need to go
below
near
Hades?
The core of the Earth? Is that where Hades is? Core of the Earth? I'm not sure.
Probably.
Yeah, but I guess at least she gets over that bar, whereas Clive doesn't. But yes, getting away from Clivey boy. Do we want to go through your second subject, which was ideology, identity, and anti-intellectualism?
I'd like to finish the technical debt with some quick notes. These are going to be great because we can do them in the allocated time. Now, I know it sounds like a trite truism. One of the notes here is we can't fix everything immediately. We can make things better. And I feel like we've actually gone over that already a few times in a few stripes. The idea that change is incremental. Change is evolutionary, not revolutionary. Mind you, if anyone wants to join me for revolution, we've got options. But
I mean, you'll have to wait until I forge my sword, but I'll get there eventually.
Yeah, but
that being said, I think it's important to note here that I think I'd kind of rephrase what you're saying into that change is an exponential curve. It starts out slow, kind of like with Labour's Housing Australia Future Fund. It starts out as something relatively small, and then much like the Australia, there's like a big Australia Future Fund or something like that. There was another one which it was based off of.
That's the scope of change, not the speed of change.
Well, more so what I'm trying to say is it starts small and then it speeds up as you go forward.
Exponential.
It's like when you plant a tree. Like I've been doing a lot of gardening lately. Been growing a lot of. Basically, I have a vegetable garden. I'm growing some trees now as well.
The bloody insurance ad in my head.
I don't know which insurance ad.
From little things, big things grow.
Well, yeah, that's actually kind of it. Like, you start out with something small and you grow it into something larger. And the thing is, and this is part of why I hate the Greens is, it is not just because they keep saying, well, it's not good enough, and they don't seem to get the fact that, well, it starts small and it gets bigger over time. It grows over time.
A society is great when old men plant trees in whose shade they will never sit.
Oh, I love that. I love that proverb. But yes, but also the point that I want to make about the Greens and their whole not good enough mentality and attitude is that it's not that they don't know this, it's that they know this and they're acting like it isn't true. They're pretending that this principle doesn't exist for political brownie points. That's why they blocked the ETS and then implemented a worse version of it, is because they could attach their brand to it, their label. That's why they tried to block the half, and did for a while block the half, before they started, losing popularity, losing those political brownie points over it. And I would say that in much the same way that the Liberals and Nationals are incredibly unprincipled, the Greens are too. I really want to hit that point home, that they are the Liberal Party if the Liberal Party was successful at bullshitting people into thinking that they care about the environment.
But also, I think the thing is, the typical Greens voter doesn't tend to have significant economic challenges. Like, mostly wealthy voters, mostly people who don't really have to care about their day-to-day paycheck. But it's quite easy for them to really kind of appeal to that type of person rather than Labor, who obviously are far more of I hate this fucking term because the Liberal Party use it, but a broad church.
Okay, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm going to
Just
have to
before that,
split
Horst,
myself a little extra just for a second.
Just before that, Horst, real quickly, the way that, because James, you're absolutely right. The way that I describe that, when I talk to people, is that the voters, the core voting and support base of the Greens and the Liberals is essentially the same. It's just that one is the rich parents in society, and the other is the spoiled rich kids of those parents in society.
And then you've got the hybrid, which is the Teals.
Okay, so
yes.
I'm just going to the thing I
we'll
forgot
get to them later
about political skills. I spent 7 years working for Natalie Gould. Okay,
remind me who she is again. I'm crap with names.
Bob Gould's daughter.
Okay, remind me who Bob Gould is again. Crap with names.
Bob Gould
What
was
position
one of
did he hold?
Oh no, just proprietor of Gould's bookstore, but spent so much of his time being an aggressively annoying socialist that his ASIO file was this fucking thick. I'm not joking. Anyway,
Yeah.
but what I picked up, and the term that you are looking for, perhaps, James, is champagne socialist.
Yeah.
This idea of, oh yes, we can all build a better world, and we can uplift the downtrodden, and we can save the rainforests. Oh, wouldn't it be lovely? From people who've never had a problem in their lives.
You got to connect environmentalism with how can you improve people's day-to-day lives. How can you improve their bills? Like, this is the sort of narrative that actual effective environmentalism is.
Well, remember what I said earlier about, like, a renewable energy turns a profit. What happens
and it's 20% cheaper than fossil fuels on average.
What would happen if, instead of, like, building giant new facilities, you undertook as policy that every new house in Australia must be built with a solar system, like a battery storage system and solar panels on the roof? You would have the environmental benefits of the heat not ingressing into the building as severely. You would have the environmental benefits of, like, an increased renewable energy input over, like, massive surface area. What would happen if you undertook a policy to pay for, I don't know, 3/4 to 4/5 of the cost of putting solar panels on existing houses?
I think Labor's actually doing something with that. I have a vague memory coming to mind of like a low interest loan scheme.
Yeah, the names,
for getting people to have solar panels on their home.
Yeah,
rebates for heat pumps. They're doing rebates for heat pumps, things like that.
That still requires home ownership, though, which is out of scope for a lot of the sort of people who would be interested in that sort of scheme.
Yeah, funny enough, I actually wanted to do that, but because I rent, I can't. And that's actually one of the things I want to talk to my landlord about. Is I don't know, figuring that out somehow. Though I haven't really got any ideas just yet, but I'll think about that later. But one thing that I do want to point out in regards to having sort of environmentalism sort of demonstrating benefits on a more sort of personal and human level of that is that having a more, I guess, greener, more natural environment around you as a person leads to much better mental health. Like
100%.
mental health in Sydney is just it's going down the toilet.
Mental
It's
health
incredibly
everywhere is
stressful
going
there.
down the toilet.
Every
I mean,
time I go
yes,
into
but
the bush,
especially Sydney.
every time I go into the bush, whether it's for a walk in the Blue Mountains or I go to even, like country Victoria, country New South Wales, even like Adelaide, somewhere that's a smaller kind of, it's sort of a city, but it's a smaller kind of place, I just mentally feel better. Like,
Yeah,
you can look in the sky and see stars as opposed to in a big city where
oh, I should say,
pollution, you
okay,
can't even see
That's
anything.
the built environment stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, and I've been living
The
in
air
Lithgow
smells
for a
nice.
while now. Yeah, I've been living in Lithgow for a while now, and I originally moved out here for a couple of reasons, but one of them was because my previous place was on the bend of a main road in Marrickville, and at 3 a.m. truck goes past, metal object in the back. I would wake up nonstop. I terrible sleep, terrible mental health, terrible everything. I move out here within 6 months. I'm already feeling a lot better, and it's like when I walk outside, there's now a grass front yard and trees, and there's parks. You only need to walk for a couple of minutes anywhere in Lithgow to get to a park. And one of the things that
And
one
that's a
of
design
the
choice too.
yeah,
The
and
way
that was
Lithgow is
actually what I was
built.
about to get into. Yeah, that's actually what I was about to get into. Is that one thing, like how to align that sort of in an economic sense, and a mental health sense with the environment. One thing that I'm working on with the economic development plan that I'm doing is this sort of, I call it a village urban layout. The idea is that you have like a block of houses, but then in the middle, instead of having like big backyards, you have like a park that every backyard opens up into, and essentially you've got that right there. And so it's both at once it's community, which we are very much lacking in our society today. We do not have, like, communities at best are based around special interests, and it's not like it's something you usually have to travel for. Even with tabletop gaming, which was my special interest back in the day in Sydney, I had to travel for 45 minutes just to get to the place that would be at. Whereas if you have a block of houses with a park in the middle,
Then
you walk
everyone
out
can
the
play
back.
D&D in the park on Sundays.
Brilliant idea. But that's sort of an example of a way in which you can match up all of those interests. You can align, economics with mental health with the environment. And that's something that I don't see the Greens trying to do. I don't see, obviously Liberals and the Nationals aren't trying to do it. I don't really see, that level of sophistication in most political policy, outside of the Labour Party. And so, that's I'm losing my train of thought, but that I think that's basically the point that I'm trying to make. All right. So that being said,
I think
have
that
we only
message
got
just
through
got
one subject?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. We are not following the structure very well. So
Yeah, we're really
I
not.
keep
So
trying
let's
to
Which
try
is
and
quite ironic because in the pre-planning, I was the least structured. You guys are the more structured. I
yeah.
just wanted to wing the whole thing.
Our enemy is our enemy is ourselves, and our plan has not survived first contact.
Okay, so I am going to do the last point on technical debt. I am going to do it, and we're going to try and... Yeah, this is what happens, right? The main thing that I'm seeing as technical debt at the moment is...
We should get off technical debt.
No,
Come
no,
on.
no. We are doing the last point, and we will switch to the next one, and we will...
All right, no follow-up questions then. Make it quick.
I don't think there needs to be follow-up questions to this. Like, the biggest technical debt at the moment that we have is... well, capitalism, but not quite like that. We learned the hard way in early 2020, after it turned out that a biolab in Wuhan managed to accidentally a pandemic. That
Wait. Paused. you got to remember it was a bioweapon created by the Biden administration, planted in the Ukraine to start a war with Russia, and Putin is going in there to liberate the Ukrainian people from the tyranny of this anti-Semitic Jew, Zelensky. This is what a bloke at my old job. Well, my
for those people out there who are thick as a brick. For those people out there who are thick as a brick, he is being incredibly sarcastic. He is joking. I know it's obvious, but someone out there is going to not realize.
It'll be on a video and like saying that I'm like supporting Trump at a Patriots.
For the love of God, do not chop that into a short, Kyle. Okay, so
it's too late. I will.
Anyway, the biggest technical debt that we incurred.
We're M-rated now.
The biggest technical debt that we incurred is, as we learned at the beginning of 2020, was that we are dependent on a global supply chain that is too complex for any one person to understand. Most of our things are being manufactured in East Asia, and, you know, if something goes wrong, we don't really produce things ourselves in Australia. Like, this is... What I've got in my hand is a microcontroller board. This is just a consumer thing, but there's something like this in basically every appliance you have. Your dishwasher, your fridge, your air conditioner. There's a bunch of them in your car. The only people who make them are in Taiwan. And we all know that Taiwan has enough mountains to deter immediate attack, but, like, this is not really survivable. We are dependent on global logistics that we don't understand to have the things that we depend on in everyday life. We used to make things in Australia. For the longest time, the CSIRO, if any of you don't remember that, that is the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation. Their entire mandate was to use scientific advancements to push forward Australian business. We don't make shit anymore. We need to start making things here.
I don't disagree with what you just said. What would you say to the counter narrative, which is generally that, you know, if we were to produce these things here, they'd be more expensive and would cost the consumer more?
I would say that would mean that there was increased consumer choice, and that the same free market, which you suspect a price pressure may exist in, is also a market in which market agents, in this case customers, would have the ability, as they do in many other areas already, to pay a little extra and have that little Made in Australia triangle.
That being said, I would also point out that they are marked up considerably. Like, there is a considerable markup even when shipping it from overseas, where it's made quite cheaply. In fact, there was this whole scandal about things like Gucci and all that, because after the tariffs were put on China in the United States,
it turned out that all these luxury brands were just manufacturing in China anyway.
Yeah, and so what China's done is they've basically put a bunch of videos out. People in China have just put a bunch of videos out showing, hey, this is where we make it, and here's how to order from the manufacturer directly. You can get a designer Gucci bag for, like, you know, $50 instead of $5,000.
China doesn't give a damn about IP law, so, like...
Yeah, they don't care. You know, they just, like, it's literally just, like, it's just a label. You know, and funny enough, going back to what we said about labels, a label doesn't tell you everything you need to know. You know, and I mean, when it comes to these designer brands, it's literally nothing more than a label, because, you know, beneath that label, it's just a made in China product anyway. And so what I would say about manufacturing in Australia is that we can actually have very competitive manufacturing. China's average wages have actually gotten much higher in recent years.
Yep.
And so
that sweet dollar from exports.
Yeah, and so they're actually quite comparable to us in terms of their wages, in terms of their salaries, and really we're like what we're paying is still a markup even on that, and so we'd be very competitive in manufacturing. Funny enough, Labor's a Future Made in Australia plan, which, to be honest, I think look, it's a nice name, but it doesn't really get to the point, which is, like, should have been called something along the lines of, high end manufacturing, in Australia,
I'm
something.
starting to understand how our timing is blowing out.
Yeah, and so, that being said, what I'd say is that it wouldn't be, if it would be more expensive, it wouldn't be much more expensive, and it
So this comes back to
probably, from
consumer
my
choice.
I think another point on this, because I'm a huge supporter of Future Made in Australia, which is, to people who don't understand it, it's pretty much trying to turn Australia into a renewable superpower. And especially if you look at what's going on in the United States with these tariffs, to me, this presents a huge opportunity to Australia to actually take that market that the US is retreating from. And yeah, I mean, this is why I think this election is very important, because I think if Labor could just get one more term, my view is that these renewables will be locked into the system. And at that point, the Liberal Party will probably concede, sort of like what Stephen Marshall did in South Australia when he came in, is he pretty much didn't do anything to reverse what the previous Labor government did, and realised that the renewables were cheaper, were better, and just continued with it. And that's why, to be honest, I think Stephen Marshall is probably one of the better liberal leaders that we've had in this country, because he just basically continued with what Labor were doing. And I think if Labor can just get this one more term, the renewables will be locked in, and the coalition will basically probably be forced to just continue with it at that point.
Yeah, and it's more than just renewables. It's manufacturing of renewable energy systems. It's manufacturing of components. Again, it's that future made in Australia, where we'll have sort of moderate to high end manufacturing. These are high skilled jobs that pay quite a fair bit, and it'd be like, it's a huge export market. Funny enough, I've actually I've been trying to tie this into my economic development plan for my region, out here, because there's a lot of, like, there used to be a lot of manufacturing out here. There used to be a lot of steel production. There was, we've still got all those old industrial sites, but they're just not really being used for much anymore, because Lithgow hasn't been, properly invested in a long time. And so that's, we're not just talking about, like, extra renewable energies. We're talking about a lot of high-end manufacturing jobs, a lot of economic prosperity into the future. We're talking about, if Labor got another term, that's 100,000 extra homes, which specifically exclude property investors. So they'd be for first home buyers only. Like, that is, like, that's going to do a hell of a lot. And we actually talked about this before the show, and then agreed we should be talking about it during the show, which makes a great segue to housing policy, which is another of the 6 subjects we're meant to be covering.
So are we going to actually do that and try and hold to time?
Yes, we're going to do it, and I'm going to be extraordinarily strict. And so
you have been rambling the most of us, Kyle.
Well, guilty as charged, but, moving on, for the sake of time. Basically, one of the points is we need to ask the question: is Labor taking enough action on housing?
No.
Well, examining it. Well, let's examine it further before we make that judgment.
A nuanced response to this. I would say, on the supply side, what they're doing is very good. This $100,000 of new homes for first home buyers look, supply is definitely an issue. It's definitely going to help. And on the demand side, I think we're all probably aligned that, we wish Albanese would go more towards what Shorten's policies were in terms of reforming capital gains and reforming negative gearing. I think if we could, even reforms where we could, maybe continue with negative gearing for, say, new properties, or say allow people to have one grandfathering it as well and allow people to have maybe one negative gearing property. That is
Very,
probably
very
something
similar to Shortens, actually.
that's probably the most realistic form of negative gearing reform we're going to get, because anything more radical than that is just instantly going to be squashed. Do I think Labor are going to do anything about it in the next term? Look, it's possible,
No.
but it's unlikely, I would say. Yeah.
I'd be very surprised if they did. But one thing that I'd point out in regards to housing is that, I mean, there's several problems, like negative gearing the capital gains tax. They make property speculation for property investors very, very profitable. And it also puts just a disgraceful amount of risk. It basically takes it away from the people who are actually investing in properties and puts it on the taxpayer. Like, we're essentially subsidizing property investment and bad investments.
But Carl, maybe explain why it's such a bad thing. I mean, why is someone who's wealthy putting their money into housing bad, as opposed to putting money into a new business project that would stimulate growth in the economy? Maybe I'll let you explain why
no worries. There's a couple of reasons here. So first is that housing doesn't produce extra value if it goes up in price. It just has the exact same value. It's a static asset.
Yeah.
And therefore, not really an asset, not really much of an asset to the economy. It's like, once it's built, it's there, great, but it will never produce any extra value than it already does. The only way to try and do that is to subdivide a house, and that just leads to smaller homes that you're overcharging rent for. And so that's sort of reason one. Reason two, I mean, property speculation, putting it simply, rich person but greedy goes into an area, buys up all the homes, then just sits on it and waits for the price to rise, because they've artificially dropped the supply while the demand remains the same. That can drive property prices up to 30% in a single year. And having seen that done since 1999, well, it's no wonder why the average price in Sydney is, I think, 1.2 million now.
So Carl, how did John Howard destroy the dream of buying homes for millennials?
He gave a 50% discount to the capital gains tax for property investors. So the capital gains tax is essentially like, you own an asset, but it increases in value, and then you sell it, and that profit that you make, where you've just got an asset like a home that's risen in price. Say you buy it for $500,000, and then later it rises in price, you sell it for $700,000. That's $200,000 in capital gains. And so there used to be there was a 30% tax on that, but the Howard government essentially reduced that 30% by half, so you got only a 15%, and that made and then combine that with negative gearing, which takes a lot of the risk and a lot of the cost off of.
Explain to people what negative gearing is.
Negative gearing, basically, let's say you're renting out an investment property, but it doesn't make enough money to cover the repayments of the loan. You basically get to claim that back on tax.
Yep.
So essentially, it reduces your taxable income. So say your taxable income, was $50,000, or probably for the property investors be a lot higher. Let's say it's $120,000, and you lose
taxable income.
For property investors, they'd have that much. But let's just say that you lose, say, 10,000 of that on an investment property, because you charge X amount of rent, but that doesn't cover the loan repayments on the home, and you lose 10,000. Your taxable income is then reduced by 10,000. And so combine negative gearing in the capital gains tax discount and that property speculation that I talked about earlier, that becomes insanely profitable, to the point where, again, we've got these very wealthy individuals going in and buying up all the properties in an area, and that, artificially reducing the supply while the demand remains the same.
Yeah.
and the price just shoots up. And we've even seen the same in rental properties. And this is sort of the point where I'd say what Labour is doing is actually quite clever, in the sense that they're building 100,000 homes that exclude property investors from the ability to buy them. It is for first home buyers only. And that's because property investors and sort of developers that do rental properties, they're holding half of all new properties off the market intentionally to keep prices high. At any moment, they could flood the market with a bunch of properties, which would bring down the prices to a more reasonable level. They could, like, we actually have a really good supply of housing there in terms of rental properties, but it's just held off the market deliberately, particularly in Sydney,
Al,
in
do you
order to
think
keep
there
those
needs to be
prices high.
Do you think there needs to be a change in culture around development?
So
I mean,
I'm going to actually take that one.
Yeah.
Because Kyle is informative, but falling into a circle.
I thought he did a really good job of explaining that.
I agree.
I mean, I will admit I do have a tendency to over-explain things every now and then. But you know, I did
now and then.
Yeah, I did explain property speculation twice then.
The culture around development is not the problem. This is going to be... I only saw this last night and it crystallized in my mind the exact problem. When you own a home, when you own a property, like, in most cases, we look at the amortization of an asset, how much its value decreases over time. Houses don't have the same problem because everyone needs shelter. But any action which would make the market more approachable to first-time buyers, whether that is the reduction or scaling back of negative gearing, whether that is massively increasing supply, is going to fundamentally decrease the value of houses for owners of houses. And nobody wants that. Nobody wants to hear, hey, the thing which you purchased for $1.2 million, if it were to be sold today, would only get $400,000. The importance of financial security is so great that it is very difficult to advance any policy which would decrease the financial security of people. And when you're looking at increasing supply, you're doing that. You're saying, we're going to do something which is going to make the thing you have a lot less valuable. People are going to push back against that because they're scared. They're scared of...
We need to change the culture of this, though, because, look, I'll
just before we get to that, James, one thing I want to note about your question before, because you asked how did Howard essentially destroy the hopes and dreams of all millennials and Gen Zs.
You already explained that.
Yes, but this is specifically the sort of how that actually... I mean, that was how, but this is the point that I think in part matters, is that in what he did, in what the Liberal government then did, they created a permanent disincentive to make good reforms to the property market. And that will never go away. They have permanently, completely destroyed any chance for true reform in the property market. It will never happen because of that. And I think the only way that we could get reform is if, or in my opinion, when the property market crashes and collapses the economy, because, well, property prices will have already fallen in that regard, and that'd be the only window of opportunity to ever implement any reform.
I think that you're probably right about that. Generally, it takes economic crisis for proper reform to be accepted by the public. However, on what we can actually control at the moment, which is, kind of what Horst was touching on, this idea of I've got an outer suburban nice house. I don't want someone building an apartment block next to me, not in my backyard kind of type thing. This, for me, is a cultural problem. Because if we're going to keep growing as a population in this country, we fundamentally need this. If we're going to keep...
problem though.
Actually, there is sort of a problem there that he is talking about, which I think there is a solution for that I know of, and because essentially the biggest problem is that we're building essentially all the new houses in just Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane, and if you keep like to build homes, to build an apartment block next to that home might decrease the value because of the increase in supply. What we need to do is build homes in, well, new towns, new cities, or existing towns and cities that actually have much more room for that. Like, again, not to harp on my economic development plan, but one part of it is to build 7,500 homes in Lithgow.
Even doing that will decrease the value of properties, because if you have a house here that's worth 1.2 million, and you have a house over here that's like an hour's commute that is $100,000, it's a no-brainer. You will take the fact that you can suddenly own a house, and you will accept the compromises that come of that. And that means that house that's worth $1.2 million, all of a sudden, it doesn't have that value.
Yes, although I would point out the specific that Lithgow by train is 2.5 hours away, which is, it's not exactly a daily commute that everyone.
I'm not talking about Lithgow. I'm just talking about, like, generally the idea of building housing in new cities is still a threat, and that is why it is difficult to get the...
I think it'd be less of a threat. I think it depends on distance, whether or not it's a threat. Because essentially, if again, taking Lithgow as an example, if you build a bunch of new housing in Lithgow and people move here, they're going to be working in Lithgow or somewhere in the country. They're not going to be working in Sydney unless they're working remotely. Which
does go to another point, which is that I think more flexibility in terms of people's capacity to work from home could ease some burden on some of these stresses, which is another reason why another massive mistake Dutton, I think, has made in this election campaign. But
that actually, on that working from home, because I've done working from home. I've done only in office work. I've done, I've worked a ton of different jobs. Personally, I think what would make it even better and even easier is if you had something akin to like co-working spaces with sort of groups of offices. Because then you get the benefit of, you go to work and you get away from home. There's less distraction, and you got that separation between work life and home life. But at the same time, you do have that benefit of being able to work close by, and you don't need that commute. You can work remotely. I think personally that is the best middle ground between those two.
Well, look, I've worked in recruitment for 5 years, and I've done purely working in the office. I've done purely working from home, and I've done a hybrid of, half from home, half in the office. And I can tell you that working from home has never affected me in my productivity whatsoever. In fact, in some ways, I've actually found it easier. Now, I do actually enjoy going into the office a couple of times a week, just for the social aspect. But, if I were to buy a property out in, an hour and a half, hour out of, the Sydney CBD, I would want to have that flexibility, and I would not want to be going into the city more than once or twice a week. It's just, and if I'm hitting my targets and doing the job just as effectively, I don't see why it's anyone's business. It's really between me and my employer, right?
Yeah, and so that's let's see. I mean, we kind of already. I think we've kind of done the point about whether or not Labour is taking enough action, and sort of we've also gotten into the kinds of, well, I think we covered like several points there.
Let's touch on how problematic the coalition's housing policies are.
Because
why is their super policy a shocker?
I mean, do you want to, I know I said no swearing anywhere, but I mean, do we really want to fuck people's retirement income?
Not to mention increasing the price of property. That's all it's going to do.
Yeah, it's like, I mean,
Putting
they've
more,
just
more
been-
stress on the taxpayer down the track because there's more people dependent on the pension. It's a horrible idea.
Yeah, and this is actually part of why I think the property market is definitely going to fail at some point, and it's going to collapse because money just keeps getting funneled into it. Like it's this black hole that does not produce value. Like there's again the value of a home, the value that it provides doesn't increase with its price, and so by funneling all of this money into it, it's hollowing out the rest of the economy. And Dutton's plan for using your super for housing, it's just going to further inflate the prices, and that, I mean, if anything, it's just going to make the crash happen sooner, or make it worse. Like there's no solution there. There's no benefit. It's something that, kind of like a lot of the Greens policies, it seems good on paper if you don't think about it at all, but really it's just going to cause a whole lot more problems.
And their tax deduction policy, what do we think of that one?
Remind me of that again. I've forgotten it.
So if you buy a new home as a first home buyer, you can get a tax deduction on your repayments. That's their other policy. Yeah.
That's actually
So
a
basically-
sensible policy.
So
Is it?
question, is that basically just negative gearing but for your home instead of an investment property?
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm kind of split on this because, one, in terms of helping people to afford homes, not the worst idea in the world, but at the same time, it's just going to be funneling even more money into the housing market.
That's exactly
Like-
where I sit on it. Like
like,
it's
yeah.
it's certainly not as bad as their super policy. We can agree on that.
Yeah, I'll
but
at
it is
least
gonna
give them
blow
this
by.
much. As much as it pains me to give even the least bit of credit to Peter Dutton, it's at least got one upside. Even if the downside is horrendous, it's at least got one upside. That being said, like, I still think that I mean, Labor's plan is already a lot better. Building
we're at a
100,000
point
homes for
where
first
we
home
need-
buyers.
We're at a point where we need government intervention to fix this. Like, it's a market mechanism. I just think we need the government, like, at least building these new properties for first home buyers is gonna offer some assistance. It's not gonna fix the problem. You really want to fix it, you got to do something about capital gains and negative gearing. But that I understand is political poison. It's basically the equivalent of the Liberals' Medicare. Liberals touch Medicare.
Yeah, I will say this, because you said it's like a market solution, though I don't quite think it is. It's more like it's basically a subsidy. And what's it called? Take Labor's plan, which there's an insurance thing which the government covers. I think it's like a home loan or mortgage insurance or something like that. I forget the details, but they're also
Can I
basically they
touch
have a
on
plan where they
responding to that?
in a second.
Yeah.
Part of that plan is also that they're essentially buying a stake in everyone's home, essentially reducing the total cost of the home.
Buying 40%.
Yeah, which also, I mean, that's like in a weird way, although that will still funnel money into the housing market, I think it's going to do less than the mortgage one because it's, instead of just a subsidy, it's buying a stake in it, which can then be later bought back by the homeowner. And at the same time, the more, like, it's not just a subsidy which funnels more money into the property market. It's something that kind of, even though it's not quite market driven, it takes the market into account. Where I think that the Liberal policy doesn't really, because it is just a direct subsidy. It's more of an intervention.
My point in terms of market mechanism, Kyle, was more that, like, yes, it is a subsidy, but more that Labor is actually saying we are going to build this number of houses, whereas what I meant was the Liberals is more like a manipulation of policy
Yeah.
to try and get more property built. That's what I meant. More like, whereas Labour is saying we're going to build this. That's more what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think in it, like, although I get what you're saying, but I do think it kind of undersells Labour, because Labour has a Labour's approaching it from multiple aspects, because you've got, they're covering the like mortgage insurance. They're buying a stake in the property, which is kind of like a subsidy, but not really, because essentially that's them buying equity, which reduces the cost of the home and the cost of the mortgage, which makes it a lot more affordable, and you can buy it back from them later on if you save up the money to do so. On top of that, they've got the Housing Australia Future Fund, which it's tackling social and affordable housing. The extra supply, which is really the only thing they can do with the current political situation, increasing the supply with 100,000 homes. All of that combined is a very, it's a multi-layered approach to the problem, which is a little bit more sophisticated and I think a lot more effective. Whereas solutions from the coalition and the Greens, Liberals and the Greens, are just incredibly simplistic. And a lot of them are just like with the Greens, with capital gains and negative gearing. Politically speaking, it's just not feasible.
A mate of mine at my former job. Look, I must admit, he's politics are absolutely fucked. Good, he's a mate of mine. He's a good guy, but he is one of these people who believes that super is a form of theft. Taking his money and putting it into a fund. Maybe we can,
super is a form of theft. Did you say?
He basically thinks that super is a form of theft. He's one of these crazy. Look, he's a really good guy, but politically he's just insane.
I understand the logic, but what the heck?
I see. It's not theft, because you get it back, but you get it. It's a retirement savings,
and you get more of it back.
Yeah, it's an investment.
Yeah, and on top of that, it's also I once met a guy who said taxes were theft, which is I wish I had I was so dumbfounded by the idea that I couldn't even formulate a response.
Taxation without representation is theft.
Well,
that's the trick.
Sort of. Here's the thing. I wish what I said to him is, no, taxes are payment for services rendered. That's the service of having roads, having having infrastructure, having public services, policing, having defense, having
Gina
all.
Reinhardt exist.
Gina Reinhardt exists.
Yeah.
Am I the only person who gets
I wouldn't say that's a service.
That's what I'm saying. Taxpayer. This is why I say taxation without representation. When taxpayers are subsidizing the interests of the super rich, that is not a service rendered. That is theft. It is theft legitimized.
Am I the only one here who gets a migraine when Gina Reinhardt speaks?
No.
I get too many migraines generally to be absolutely certain that it's Gina Reinhardt speaking that triggers it. But
it doesn't help though.
It really doesn't.
Yeah, I've only listened to her speak a couple of times.
I'm so sorry.
It is so. She is mind-numbingly stupid in that it numbs my mind to listen to her.
And mind-numbingly entitled as well. That's what I fucking hate. Her speak, and she has this born to rule. I'm better than you. Pull yourself up.
I deserve everything in the world.
Kind of,
this
sort of
kings.
This Ayn Rand, Curtis Yarvin horse shit.
Yeah, you're right. The sense of entitlement there is absolutely ridiculous. And that being said, I think we've covered everything in housing policy, and we haven't gone too much over time with that. Let's see. We've got. Investors. We talked about the Greens earlier and their political opportunism regarding housing. Labor's action and whether it's enough. Personally, I think Labor's headed very much in the right direction, and I think in the short term it's enough, and I think in the long term we will probably get enough. But again, it's it's an exponential, sort of curve on how much is done and on how much we get. It's like planting a tree.
My hope is, look, if Labor, look, I don't think Labor are going to get a thumping victory. I think it'll be a similar type of result to 2022, if not maybe a minority government. But
I
my hope is that Labor get a thumping majority, and I think if that happens, they may be a little bit more ambitious next time round at the next election.
I think I if this was 2 weeks ago, I would have agreed with you on the possibility of minority government. I think they're probably going to get a a majority, and they might even gain a seat or two because have you seen recent polling?
I have seen recent polling. Recent polling would basically suggest we're looking at a rerun of either 2022, if not Labor gaining its 1 or 2 percentage points on 2PPP. If they gain 2% on TPPP, we're looking at them being mid-80s in terms of their seats. I personally, just the 2019 effect, polls tend to always sort of underestimate the Conservatives a little bit just around the world. So I just think that needs to be taken into account. And I think they'll probably get, I'd say, in the 70s in terms of seats. I can't tell you where it's going to land.
It's kind of interesting you say that because when Jeremy Corbyn was making his first run as Labour leader in the UK, the polls actually underestimated him by 20 points.
There's always exceptions, Kyle, like the midterms in the US with the Democrats. Like there are exceptions, but I'm talking about in an Australian context, the polls last time round were pretty accurate, but they probably slightly underestimated the 2PPP. Sorry, TPP, I should say.
Yeah. So the polling in Australia, from memory, usually the most that it's ever off is about 3 to 4 points. With Shorten in
3 points they were off.
2019, he also because of the Medivac bill for the, I think it was like Manus Nauru, the detention centers. Essentially, the idea that a doctor should be able to like choose whether or not people, those refugees seeking asylum, should be brought to Australia to a proper hospital for medical attention.
Yep.
They lost, I think it was like 2 or 3 points in polling just on that, right next to the end. So, if we'd gotten, essentially, it kind of swung the trajectory at the last second. So unless something were to swing the trajectory at the last second here, which we've basically got a week for that to happen, so I don't really think that's.
I think it's probably impossible for Dutton to get to majority. I think it would take something extraordinary for that to happen.
Yeah, I don't think he's got any chance of being in government because the last polling that just came out, two-party preferred was 53-47.
Let's wait for the news poll. Let's wait for news poll tonight. Like if news poll comes back 52-48 to Labor, I'm pretty confident Labor will win. If it comes back 50-50, then I'll be nervous.
Game.
Yeah. At the same time, the Liberal Party's primary vote has dropped below Labor's primary vote.
I don't trust a lot of these polls, Kyle. Like Roy Morgan has a very pro-Labor bias. Redbridge has a bit of a pro-Labor bias. The one that is almost always accurate is News Poll. Almost always. News Poll is right on the money with almost every single state election. It missed the Shorten ScoMo election by about 2.5 points, but it was right on the money last election. So let's see what it says tonight. If it comes back 53-47, then you can pretty much call it game over just about.
Yeah, and that, so that I think, yeah. All right, so that's basically housing. We've talked about property investors, housing supply, all that.
Should we move on to international relations?
I mean, I'd like to because we're at 11:10 a.m. We've got
15 minutes left.
Yeah, I'd like to get to. I mean, we've already kind of half covered one of the subjects I put forward, which was who will make a better government, Labour or LNP. I'll very quickly just go through a couple of points there. Really, just speed run this. So, one thing I'd like to talk about is, for people when voting is what is politics really and how are governments formed, because these are two very important things to take into account. Politics, a lot of people argue it's about ideology, it's a battle of ideas. It's none of that stuff. Quite simply, politics is the process by which power, wealth, and resources, by which the distribution of power, wealth, and resources is decided. So in our country, with our politics, we vote, whoever we vote for, they get the power, and then they decide the distribution of wealth and resources. We pay taxes, they decide where the taxes go. And so that's what politics is, and how governments form in Australia is whoever gets a majority in the lower house of parliament, the House of Representatives, where your local member is, whoever gets a majority or at least the most seats there, they tend to be invited by the Governor General to form a government. And so it's a party that forms a government. As much as I'd like to make it not a party personally, that is how our system works. So when thinking about who to preference, think about who you want to be in government. My primary vote is not going to be going to the major parties. It's not going to be going to Labour, but Labour will be getting my preferences. And they'll be getting that because they form a competent government. Every time they're in government, it is competent. Yes, even during the Rudd-Gillard years, Gillard less so. Rudd, personally, I think he was amazing and he ran a great government. But at the same time, even during Gillard, you could call her the worst Labour Prime Minister there was, but she was still a competent Prime Minister. She ran a competent government, and it was still better than any Liberal National government throughout our entire history. The second point, I actually just covered the second point, which is how have Labour and Liberal governed in the past, and what's been the results of their government. Well, one's competent, one is at best competent at benefiting billionaires, and at worst entirely incompetent. The best example that we can see of that was the Morrison government, where they completely messed up the response to 3 disasters in 3 years: the fires, the floods, and the pandemic. Their response to that was criminally negligent.
I don't hold a hose.
In my opinion. Oh, okay, yeah.
You can add the NBN, you can add Snowy Hydro, you can add
NBN,
all
Snowy
sorts
Hydro,
of others. All the rorts that happened.
Sports rorts, car park. I mean, hell, they couldn't even build car parks.
Morrison should have won. Morrison would have absolutely won the 2022 election had these scandals not happened. Had he turned up for the bushfires, done what Albo did during the cyclones, and just been there and been supportive, put funding into it.
Yeah.
This is what I respect about Tony Abbott, right?
Just before that, one point on what you just said when you mentioned cyclone. Take the cyclone in Queensland. His own seat of Dixon, Peter Dutton, did not show up except for a short press conference, and then he headed down to Sydney to sweet talk a billionaire into giving him more money.
As a police officer, I learnt the importance of being an asshole.
So, as you're saying, Horst?
This is the one thing I really respect about Tony Abbott. We disagree so much on politics, but he... Remember how I said that, Pauline Hanson at least has convictions? Tony Abbott at least has convictions. He maintained currency as an RFS volunteer firefighter, and when bushfires hit, he went out and he did his fucking duty. And he realised that, he could be useful. He could let the policy wonks do policy wonk shit. He went out and he did what he knew how to do. He actively went out to combat bushfires. And when the media came to sort of say hi, he told them to fuck off and do some real work because there's a fire ground here. And, he's not saving their asses from their own stupidity. I respect
He was a conservative. Morrison was a snake oil salesman.
Yeah, but, here's the thing. Conservatives... Those who call themselves conservatives frequently don't realise that if you burn down every social institution, there's nothing left to conserve.
The irony is, preserving the environment should be a conservative value.
Absolutely.
It really should. It really should. But that being said, I'll agree with you on Abbott there. As much as much as I think he was an incredibly incompetent leader, didn't know what he was doing. He was really like as much as I don't think the guy has a great degree of intelligence or even charisma. I will respect that he at least has convictions.
Bro
He
has
he
negative
believed
voters.
much. Yeah. Okay, let's not head into the brain rot territory just
Jesus
yet. You know,
says
leave
that
that
there's a
until
place for
Mehmed's
everyone,
off.
and Australia is not necessarily the place for refugees.
I mean, look.
What the housewives of Australia need to understand.
Oh god. Okay. Look. No, I can't even listen to that. I can't listen to that one again. That was just just the worst.
Remember, he
But that-
made himself minister for women.
Yeah. Let's. Okay, I'm
It's
gonna
like-
scrub that from my mind for a second time now.
Here's the thing,
Um,
I am uniquely qualified to be Minister for Women because I intend to fuck every single one of them in Australia.
What we're doing for women is we're going to stop the carbon tax, which is going to help women in the kitchen.
We're going to make
All right,
sure
let's-
we're going to make
like,
sure
let's
that
not-
abortion
let's not run over
care
time.
is removed so that every woman can fully appreciate their Bible-given destiny of producing children.
Look, you got to
Yeah,
understand that
say that last
sometimes
one.
shit happens, you know. Remember when he said shit happens when the soldier
Yeah.
dies?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now even I feel like using the brain
There
rot
was
terms.
something. Look, I think you know what it was. There was actually something a little bit charming about Abbott because he came across as like he was kind of being authentic, whereas ScoMo just made me want to like puke my guts out every time he spoke because it was so filtered,
Yeah.
so obviously a snake oil salesman. And even though Abbott was just cringeworthy every time he spoke, you kind of thought he actually believes what he's saying. You know what I mean?
He did, that's
Yeah.
the thing. Abbott was
Like, yeah.
genuine, and that makes
Yeah.
him both worse and better.
Yeah.
Worse because these horrible policy ideas he legitimately believes are actually good, but better because he at least has the courage of his convictions, and I
Exactly,
think
that's-
lacking from politics in many
Plus, he was
Yeah.
so insane
Yeah.
that
In a weird way, he had integrity. Yeah, and in a weird way, he had integrity. But you know, as much fun as talking about Abbott and his cringy authentic nature is, let's move on to the next.
He's just a bloke,
the next
you know.
subject.
He holds a hose and he eats an onion. He's just a true blue Aussie bloke.
I'm going to shirt front Mr. Putin. You bet you are. Sorry, you bet I am.
Yep. Yep. So, so in terms of who would make a get a government, how to vote in that, again, you vote it like
We can't tell you how
Yeah.
to vote.
We're
We
telling
can
you to
tell
vote
you
for Trump.
that a vote. We can't tell you how to vote. We can tell you that a vote that supports the Liberal National Coalition is a vote for setting your country on fire.
that is correct. And
Maybe we can move on to some international relations as well, just to explain further why the LNP cannot be trusted with government.
I love international relations. I especially love it when the prospect of paying a diplomatic conjugal visit to Melania Trump comes up.
Maybe can we explain? So,
All right.
how do we go about
before we get to that, real quickly, you know, we did speed that one in 9 minutes, including all the jokes. Let's as much as I like them, let's leave out the jokes and speed run through this next one, which was how to tell what a candidate stands for and whose interests they serve, because this really gets into, in large part, why the LNP or the Liberals and Nationals really suck. And essentially, the first point is about, you know, what candidates claim to stand for and who they claim to serve, and the second is about whose interest parliamentarians actually serve, because they're all going to claim to serve that they're all going to claim to serve your interests. They're all going to claim that, you know, they stand for X, Y, and Z, but in the end, you know, as I said with what politics actually is, it's the process by which the distribution of power, wealth, and resources is decided. And that those wealth and resources, essentially, they're delivered to interests. Now, those interests could be the public interest, or it could be the interest of a private corporation or a special interest group or a particular portion of the population. And essentially political donations and essentially campaign funding, campaign finance is what dictates whose interest those politicians really serve. Take, for example, the difference between Rebecca Sharkey, independent in South Australia, or technically she's part of Centre Alliance, but effectively in the House she is more or less an independent. She ran a campaign with, I think it was like $40,000 her first time, and won on that, surprisingly. Compare that to the Teals. Now, Rebecca Sharkey, I wouldn't say she's the greatest parliamentarian there is, but she does pretty well. She looks out for what I would call the human interest, which is your interest, my interest, it's everyone's general interest. Comparing that to the Teals are funded in large part, like mostly by Climate 200, which is an organization made up of basically people who are similar to the kinds of people you'd find in the Liberals and the Greens.
Yeah, they're
and a
people
lot
that
of
want
them
the Liberal
came
Party
from
to
that.
take the environment seriously, but know that it's a losing cause, so instead they're bankrolling people who have broadly similar policy platforms, but are more environmentally friendly.
Yeah, essentially they're liberal light, which means they're looking out for the corporate interest because that's where they're getting their funding.
That's okay. That's okay.
Simon Holmes
though,
a
right?
court.
Change
Hold
is
up.
small. If I'm just saying, I don't have a problem with Climate 200 lobbying for funding specifically one area of policy. I think that it is important to have like single issue advocates like that, and I think that it is the only way to drag the Overton window of the Liberal Party to where they want it to be.
I agree with Horse. I think the Teals have been a good thing for Australian politics in the sense that they are now forcing the Liberal Party into a position where they have to deal with the Nationals on the extreme right and the Teals now on the moderate side. So, and look, as much as I don't like the Liberal Party, if that the fact that we're actually having a debate at this election around what type of policy to conduct to get to net zero, as opposed to previous elections where the Liberal Party was, we don't believe in this. Now, I understand that the Duttons of this world don't actually believe it, but the fact is they can't now go to an election saying we're not going to do anything about climate change.
It doesn't matter because when they get voted in, they say we have a mandate. We have a mandate, and part of that mandate is environmentalism. You can't have a policy platform and say the people have agreed with our policy platform. We have a mandate to govern in this way. And
hold up.
Next
we're
time, not do that.
We're making the same mistake in this conversation, which is we're thinking that politics is about the debate. It's about the it's about the ideas being thrown around. When it's really not. Essentially the Teals in their actions in Parliament. Take industrial relations legislation. They voted pro-corporate on that. Take the recent reforms to political financing, which they've opposed. They've made all sorts of false claims about that, such as that it gives the major parties a whole lot more money. It doesn't. That is a lie. They said that they just rammed it through Parliament without any warning. That is a lie. They were negotiating with the Teals specifically it was either 3 or 6 months before it hit Parliament. Before that legislation came to Parliament, like they were negotiating with the Teals.
I need
to finish this point because after every single time they'd negotiate, the Teals went straight to the press and started complaining about it. They weren't serious about that legislation to begin with. And essentially, that legislation places real limits on political spending and political financing and donations. I would say it's not everything that I would want it to be, but it is a very good step in the right direction. And yet they've done their best to paint it as this stitch up against independence, which it's not. The major parties do not get the extra money that is claimed because any of that $90 million that they spend nationwide, that money, if it's spent in an electorate, that counts towards the electorate spending limit, even if it doesn't have the candidate's name on it. If it just has, say, the Labour Party on it, it counts towards that limit. And they have just straight up directly lied about that. And for people who wanted a truth in political advertising bill, they have done a lot of false advertising regarding the Labour Party and the election campaign financing reforms that they've put forward. And on top of that, when it comes to the interests that they serve, which really explains why they've done this, the interests that they serve, like Simon Holmes a Court, founder of Climate 200, used to be a Liberal Party fundraiser for an organization called Kuyong 200. And he was kicked out for basically writing a couple of articles that criticized the Liberal Party wanting to keep coal-fired plants open. And the majority of the people involved with Climate 200 at its core are former Liberal Party people.
So
and
people who have didn't work and decided to build something.
Look, Kyle,
their financial interest is still the financial interest is still rich people,
Yep.
and they're going to basically be the Liberal Party on everything except the environment.
I get that, but you're blathering here, and you've also ascribed a mistake that doesn't exist. Sorry, James.
You're right. You're right about all that. But I just see this as a given. Like, you're not going to get liberal lights to support industrial relation policy of the Labour Party. You're just not going to get that. So it's kind of, I see it as a win that you're getting people that are at least breaking with the conservative orthodoxy on climate change and forcing the Liberal Party into a position where they have to pivot on that. That is a win. And take the win. That's kind of
it's definitely better than the Liberal Party.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the Liberal Party, they haven't really pivoted on climate change at all. At best, they once or twice paid it lip service, but they have not actually pivoted on climate change. And at the same time, much like the Greens with the Housing Australia Future Fund, they're doing their best to hold up vital legislation, even in areas where they have said they want that legislation, like campaign finance reform.
And if they continue doing that, they'll push people to the Teals. And if the Teals...
the Teals. No, I'm talking about the Teals did that. The Teals have held up... they've held up, legislation on issues where they themselves have said, we're in favor of this sort of legislation on these issues. Yeah. And they've lied about it. They've been incredibly dishonest about the campaign finance reforms.
This is why I want Labor to get a majority, because... I don't want the Teals and the Greens to be, the ones with the balance of power with this. I mean, I'd rather that the Liberals have control, but
they talk about keeping the bastards honest, so to speak. Yet they're the ones being incredibly dishonest. From the Greens with their Housing Australia Future Fund to the Teals with the electoral finance.
Good though, because the Teal independents proved that Liberal safe seats weren't so safe. And that breaking inertia is enough for people to actually sort of a little bit more critically engage and go, okay, what am I actually voting for? And this comes into your idea of, what policies do politicians have? Who do they say they serve? And this is where I have to disagree with you a little about the nature of politics. Because while you're right, politics is the mechanism by which the distribution of resources is decided, it's also a big part of that is convincing enough people, to decide to see things your way, that you get to make that decision. The voter-facing end of politics is broken promises, lies, and a few sprinkles of empathy and understanding for the struggles that the constituents face. They will say what will get them elected. They will say that their policies are the policies that they believe will get them elected. They will say that they represent the interests of the group that they believe is going to vote for them. I'm sorry to be so absolutely mercenary here, but the sad truth is that the voter-facing side of politics is being served a shit sandwich and told that it's haute cuisine.
2 questions. By who do you think they're being served a shit sandwich?
Ultimately society at large, but also by every single politician trying to curry their favour.
Okay, well, on that I disagree. Okay, up front, I want to say I don't particularly like the Labour Party. However, they're not serving a shit sandwich. They've got good policy. it's not the best policy that there could be, but it meets the needs. It meets, like, it's meeting everyone's needs. It's dealing with the issues, and it's, you know, it's not going to deal with them in an overnight fashion. But, well, Rome wasn't built in a day,
You're
and
telling me that Labour
neither
has
is our
never been
future.
dishonest with campaign promises? The shit sandwich I'm talking about here is not the policy, it's the things that we tell the voters.
Here's a reality. I'll just give you a reality right now. Say the Greens had a majority government right now. Here's a matter of fact. If they were to switch off exports overnight, at the next election they would be utterly wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a fact. The Labour Party will not switch off exports of fossil fuels overnight, because of the fact that we get so much of our GDP from that, and they get so much revenue from that, and they know if they did that, they would be finished overnight. But what they are doing is they're setting up a plan for us to export other things in 20, 30 years from now, when we get to hopefully net zero by 2050. The Liberal Party just have no plan for 2050.
So the policy there
is there, we're done. You know?
Less than 20 or 30 years even. Like, the Future Made in Australia plan is designed to take effect a lot quicker than that. You know, we're talking, I think it was 5 to 10 years we'd see the effects in full swing. And also the other question that I had, Horst, was, you know, because you're not wrong. Part of politics is convincing people to get on side. But, you know, we've got 5 corporate media machines, the entire corporate propaganda network, trying to convince people of one of two things: either that both major parties are exactly the same and therefore we need a minority government to hold them account, or just generally that Labour is shit. And, you know, these are corporate media machines serving the corporate interest, and again being dishonest to people in order to do that. Essentially, how is Labour supposed to do that? Well, funny enough, I actually know the answer to this question, but I want your take on it. How is Labour supposed to combat that and demonstrate truth when there's that much of a tsunami of propaganda to combat?
Look, I have ideas about that we've spoken about with regards to legislative mechanisms for ensuring that reporting is fair and honest. Note, I say fair and honest, not balanced. Because I
assume by fair you mean like accurate, provides context,
yes,
that sort of thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, you're right. The tsunami of distruth is real, and that's one of my things, and I'll deal with that in a bit. But the fact is that almost every politician is also muddying the waters, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by misrepresenting material realities and what they are capable of doing in office. Like, I don't have a right now snap my fingers and it works solution for the tsunami of disinformation. I do think that truth still has value, and I'm not even sure if that's a realistic assessment anymore. I am starting to worry that my concept of the truth being important may be some sort of romantic notion of the past, and that fucking horrifies me. That is a deeply terrifying concept, that the engagement of the populace doesn't need any sort of genuineness. I don't want to live in that world.
I kind of reject the idea that there's ever been really this level of truth in anything. I mean, look at the Bush administration. They lied to people for years about weapons of mass destruction, and look at the awful fallout from the Iraq War. I mean, it's had a disastrous effect on international stability, on, you know, trust in government. You know, you could argue it's led to the populist right to some degree. It's, you know, yeah. I just think it's always been a problem, and it's always going to be a problem. It's just kind of the nature of it, which sucks, but yeah.
Yeah, and on that, actually, there's I think his name is Joseph Stiglitz, economist, in that. but he was actually talking about propaganda in relation to um, the economy in the United States during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
And he talks about the idea very briefly of true propaganda, like propaganda, like essentially a narrative formulated to explain the truth.
Yeah.
And I think in part, when I was talking before about good politics or good policy being good politics, and how Keating was able to do that, and how Dan Andrews was able to do that. I think that's kind of the key to it. That's really what they were able to do, is they were able to both dispel the corporate narrative while essentially creating a narrative that was accurate to the truth, and therefore demonstrating the truth to people in a way that was engaging. Something which requires a lot of intelligence and charisma. But I think that is kind of the key.
But Kyle,
As well as providing a lot of education around propaganda, sort of, helping people to build up a resistance.
but Carl, Dutton's going to stick it to the woke agenda. He's going to stick it to them.
Yeah.
I think that the headphones over my ears are the only thing stopping my brain from leaking out right now.
I love what Bill Burr said. He's like, he said that as long as you put the word woke in front of anything, you can make more money off it.
Kind of the opposite these days, wouldn't you say? I think the
No,
propaganda model.
I mean is Bill. What he meant was because Ben Shapiro was attacking him because of he'd been railing against the elites, like Elon Musk particularly, and Shapiro was calling him woke, and Bill Burr's just like, just because you put the word woke in front of it doesn't fucking mean anything. That was basically the point.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Like it's just a bullshit
I get what
word,
you're saying.
And he's saying Ben Shapiro is just making more money off this by putting the word woke in front of it.
Yeah. But look, Ben Shapiro, I've both examined and seen other people examine Ben Shapiro and his shall we call it a debate style. He sort of sneaks into his questions. A lot of them are rhetorical and not meant to have an answer. And even sneaks into a lot of his answers, a lot of false premises. And by sneaking them in, they don't get questioned. And at the same time, he has I mean, look, I won't kind of blame him for this because I have the same thing where I talk a bit fast. But that's, by talking fast and sneaking premises in there, it's very much like it's a very dishonest way of winning the argument, so to speak.
Straw man the other side. That's the classic. Right?
Yeah. One that I remember, like, I mean, look, I don't really want to talk about abortion, but briefly because it's the example that comes to mind. He was asked about abortion and like whether, like, it basically was asked, what about a woman's right to choose? And he said, well, I don't have a problem with women's right to choose. What I have a problem with is killing babies.
Yeah.
It was something along those lines. That's not a direct quote, just to be clear. I don't remember the exact
It is the
quote.
basic line of argument, though. It's the false premise that a fetus is a baby, and
which the best medical science that I've seen says that it's
strongly.
Well, basically, until you get to about 22 to 24 weeks into the pregnancy, somewhere there, it's different for every woman because different genetics, but somewhere in there is where it's like developed enough to be considered a baby instead of just a fetus.
Yeah, theoretically capable of surviving alone.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Kyle, do we want to touch on
foreign policy?
Do we want to touch on why Dutton is not fit to be in charge in terms of foreign policy? Maybe let's touch on what you guys obviously know what happened with his comments around Indonesia, claiming that the Indonesian president was going to put Russian bases in Indonesia. It turned out to be completely false.
Yeah, I only have a vague recollection of that. I only have a vague recollection of that. So I guess let's go through the sort of list of points and questions that we have for foreign policy here. That one sort of ties into defense, especially since, like, although it's been kind of screwed
maybe I
up.
can touch on why I think this sort of thing is so problematic. And
Problematic is a great word. I love hearing it.
Yeah, and then we
strong
can
enough.
like, cause another example is the pact that the Solomons signed with China back
The
during
security deal.
the security deal back during 2022 under Morrison. Now that was a direct result of Morrison's hostile commentary towards China over the pandemic. I mean, for me, and then you're seeing obviously the way Dutton's handled this with Indonesia, pissing off Indonesia, Morrison before pissing off the Solomons. Why is this important? It's important because of the fact that what's happening with the US at the moment, everyone is recognizing that the US is not necessarily going to be there to defend them in the event of a blow up with another major world power. And obviously, Trump's obviously hinting at cutting off support to Ukraine at the moment, right? Why do I not trust the Liberal Party? Well, we need to be diversifying our relationships. We need to be having really strong relationships with our neighbours. Another reason, climate change.
Yeah,
Climate
that actually
change.
gets into our third point on that, which is who should we be partnering with for defence? I think Keating had the right idea in Papua New Guinea and Indonesia
100%.
being our primary defence partners, and as well as New Zealand. I think that's,
I'd say Japan and Korea as well.
Yeah, Japan and Korea. I haven't thought too much about them myself, but I think there's a couple of things I think people should know about Australia, our defensive capability, and China. Two things, or three things. First, China is our largest trading partner. If they can help it, they will not go to war with us. They don't want to go to war with Australia. They without Australian food, China would slowly start to starve to death. We export double the amount of food that we consume, and a lot of that goes to China. We are a massive net exporter of food, produce, and a lot of that is bought up by China.
1 in 4 goods that we export go to China.
Yeah, and they don't first off, economically they don't want to screw up that relationship. Second, on the in terms of just food resources, they're a net importer of food. Not getting our food produce would very likely result in them beginning to starve slowly. We're talking mass starvation. I think the estimate was something like 90 days. I could be wrong there. Feel free to look it up yourself, our lovely audience.
Mm-hmm.
This is why it was so stupid of Morrison to go and start a fight with China.
Yeah, it was so unnecessary too. He did it literally just to suck up to the United States.
I'm going to shirt front the entire nation of China. Just now,
and that's
all
why,
of China knows you're here.
I think Albo's, Penny Wong.
Was that a Milan reference?
Yes.
Wow.
I think Labour have done a good job of repairing that relationship with China.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't trust Dutton as far as I can throw him. I mean, gets the Pacific Islands as well. They consider the entry point for diplomacy is action on climate change because they see it as an existential threat to their islands, right?
Yeah, their islands, their nations are literally sinking beneath the waves.
This was definitely a factor in why the Solomons turned away from us and turned to countries like China because they see China as taking action on climate change. They saw the Morrison government as doing nothing on climate change. I mean, the Morrison government only just before the election, agreed to net zero, and I mean their policy was a complete fraud.
Much like their nuclear policy, they weren't serious about it. They never were.
This is why, for me, it's critical. It's very important that Labor get returned because if we go back to the coalition, we're going to go back to these same problems. Unable to build relationships with our neighbours. We can't trust Dutton now with Indonesia. He's gone and pissed them off the way he has. With an unstable world, with China on the rise, not like look. I personally don't think there's going to be any conflict with China at all. I think, for the reasons you mentioned, I also just don't think. I think Xi is smart enough to recognize that it's not in his interest to go to war with anyone. But with Trump retreating from the world, we do need to, consider how we're going to manage this. And as you said, what we need to be doing is building relationships with the countries around us.
Yeah, and that actually gets into our first point, actually, on this, which is how should Australia manage its foreign relations going forward? What should we be aiming for? I think, and actually that gets into all our points, because the last point there was who do we trust to handle foreign relations more? I mean, obviously it's the Labor Party, because when it comes to the Liberal Party, it's just sheer stupidity, incompetence, and like it's. I'm trying to think of an analogy. Like it's
negligence as well.
Sheer negligence. I mean, it doesn't even get into that. It's like the whole the whole adage of cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Mm-hmm.
Like it goes even well beyond that. Like that is not a severe enough metaphor to describe the level of just self-sabotage for Australia that the Liberal government is in international relations and foreign policy. It was Morrison that, just to suck up to the US even more, locked us into AUKUS, which it's 8 subs if the United States feels like it, for $370 billion, which I think with inflation is going to be more. And that's a massive amount of money for what could end up being absolutely nothing. Like it's literally in the contract. They don't have to give us the subs if they decide it's not in the United States' strategic interests.
Oh, those subs.
We could literally be paying. We could be paying for the Americans to have subs, and that's it. And they're not going to be used to defend Australia.
And this is why it was an utter disgrace that Morrison signed that deal. He did it purely to try and win an election. He thought he could wedge Labor on it. Everyone knew this was a bad idea. Everyone knew it was an outrageous waste of money, and we'd be better off with the French subs. And he purely did it because he's a fuckwit, and he did it because he's a hedonist, and he did it because he's a scumbag, and he did it because he doesn't care about this country at all. And unfortunately, Labor had no choice but to basically go with it, because they quite possibly could have lost that election if they hadn't.
Yeah, and on top of all those, lovely descriptions of his reasons why he did it, I'd also point out that I mean, you already said he did it basically to win the election, and that's because the only thing he cared about was holding on to power, maintaining power. He never did anything useful. Yeah, he never did anything useful with that power. He had government for more than 3.5 years. He was prime minister for. He cared to have the power. He didn't care to use it for anything productive, and he only cared to hold on to it. And so that was Morrison, and I don't think Peter Dutton's really going to be any better. I don't think anyone in the Liberal Party would be really any better than that.
I don't think they actually care about this country at all.
They don't. Like the Liberals and Nationals, which, I mean, they're really, one party, except that one, faction wears fancy hats. And don't get me wrong, there's some fancy hats, wonderful cowboy hats there. But I don't think that really constitutes a difference in substance when the policies are exactly the same.
That's fair.
But that being said, to sort of make the second or perhaps third point from before that I was going to, because we basically talked about China doesn't want to start a war with Australia. The AUKUS deal, it was never in Australia's best interest. And the third is that even in the most unrealistic, and I do stress unrealistic, as in this is impossible, even in the worst case scenario that you can think of, if you just ignore reality, where Indonesia decides that they're going to just let China invade Australia, which China would not invade Australia, but let's just say, let's just say they did. Let's just say that Indonesia decided we're just going to let them through. Yeah, come through our waters. Fuck Australia. Just invade them. We don't like them. Let's just say that none of our allies came to our aid. Not New Zealand, not Japan, South Korea, Papua New Guinea. Nobody. Not the US either, for which we have security guarantees. We have an actual we have the ANZUS Treaty. We have a treaty that says they must come to our aid. Not to mention the rest of the world. Let's say everybody decides, screw Australia, we want China to wipe them off the map, come on in. You know how many troops they could deliver to Australia each day at a maximum? Take a guess, James.
I hate to think.
Take a guess at how many troops, Just what's the first thing that comes to mind for how many troops Australia could get to Australia each day?
How many troops Australia could get to Australia?
China could get to Australia. How many troops can China transport to Australia daily?
Assuming
if
no
they were
resistance.
to invade Australia?
Assuming no resistance. I'm just thinking.
Can we get James first? I'm curious. I want to hear James and then yours, because I know you've already thought about it, but I don't want your hypothetical answer to this to influence James.
I mean, hypothetically, this is a country that can put together, 80 million soldiers if they need to. We're not going to be able to defeat them if it was a one-on-one.
Yeah, but how many troops do you think they could deliver each day to Australia?
I have no idea. You'll have to tell me.
Wild guess, at least.
I don't have. It could be a very low number. It could be a high number. I have no idea, to be honest.
Okay, Horse, what do you think?
About 240,000
per day.
Per day.
Okay.
That's actually, you know what? That's in the first
Let me-
day. Realistically,
Let me tell you.
once they have operations spun up, it's higher.
Let me tell you how much it actually is, because there has been a report on this in the recent past. We actually know the rough number. It's 500. That's the maximum amount of troops that they could get here using their shipping, using their supply lines. That's the maximum amount of troops they could deliver to Australia consistently each day with zero resistance. It's 500. Yeah.
That number doesn't actually make sense, but I appreciate that someone's tried to advertise it.
This was a report, I believe, from our own military. They made estimates based on what we know about China. It's 500 because they have to cross multiple seas. All right, they have to transport all of them here by ship. All right, and again, this is with zero resistance.
I was not accounting for. I was accounting for them using their heavy lift aircraft, which they do have.
Even with heavy lift aircraft, they can use that, but even with that, the maximum amount they can get here per day, at a sustained rate, is 500 per day. 500 per day is not enough to invade even a relatively small portion of Australia. And at the same time, our allies are not just going to let that happen, and we are not just going to let that happen. We'd be strafing them with different planes.
Well, Trump might let it happen.
Well, Trump might let it happen, but none of the rest of our allies would.
Okay.
Well, as long as we keep those alliances, we don't piss them all off with.
Well, that's why we need a Labour government.
Bullshit,
Yeah, that's why we need a Labour government, because they will seek to rebuild that relationship with Indonesia for that defensive alliance, that defensive partnership. They will do more with Papua New Guinea. They will do more, with other allies in the region. New Zealand, the Pacific Island nations. Japan, South Korea. Labour will have an effective foreign policy, as they always have. And so, in that regard, I think that, ultimately, in the insane scenario, in the insane scenario where China actually did to decide to invade Australia, which isn't going to happen, there's no chance of them succeeding in that. Even if all of our allies decided to abandon us, we'd still be resisting it, and we have the military hardware to significantly slow that down. Because keep in mind, every ship they lose, every plane they lose is a decrease to that 500 men per day until eventually it reaches 0, and then their men are stranded here with shit supply lines. Like, they're never going to invade Australia. It would never work if they did, even if all of our allies abandoned
it's
us.
not in their interest to attack Australia in any way, shape, or form. Like, and the thing is,
Yeah.
China doesn't have a like in the last 50 years, they have not gone to war with anyone. The last war they fought was against Vietnam, and they lost in the 70s. This is not a country that goes around starting wars with everyone. You look at the US. The US is the total opposite of that. You know, it can't keep. You know, it can't just keep to itself. It just starts unnecessary wars that blow up in its face. It's not. I always think it's barely won a war since World War II. It lost the Vietnam War. It drew the Korean War. It definitely lost the Afghan War. The Iraq War is debatable. I would say it was definitely a loss.
I mean, half and half. They won against Saddam Hussein, but they lost in the end because they couldn't. Like,
the outcomes were far worse, though. Like the indirect effects from the war have been catastrophic.
Yeah. I mean, effectively, they sort of like they won the war. They lost all their objectives in the war, which was like setting up a stable regime for their own interests.
Well, the Vietnam War, for instance, the Americans won every battle in the Vietnam War, but they lost the war.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't win hearts and minds. You know, that's always been their problem.
And that's because they were never really there for any good reason. You know, just like they were never there for any good reason in Iraq, or Afghanistan.
Freedom.
You know,
this is another thing. You know,
baby eagles.
This idea that the Netanyahu government have that they can just carpet bomb Gaza and that'll convince the Palestinian people to rise up and turn on Hamas and, you know, invite the Israelis in. I mean, this is a nonsense. It doesn't work. History has proven that this does not work. The Vietnam War proves it doesn't work. The Iraq War proves it doesn't work. The Afghan War proves it doesn't work.
Yeah, the Gulf War is a perfect example of why it doesn't.
Yeah, and, you know, it's like basically, you know, sort of bringing it back to Australia, you know, in terms of that sort of foreign policy, like what we, you know, again, I guess to finish sort of up with all the points that I was making, you know, China will never invade us. If they did, it wouldn't work no matter what. They're our largest trading partner, and they really, you know, they basically want to continue that relationship with us. And so we don't need to worry about that. None of our generals are worried about an invasion of Australia, and they're barely worried about war with China at all. You know, the only real point of contention is Taiwan, and China has stated that they do want to fix that situation in a peaceful manner anyway. Like, you know, it may not end up going that way, but like, it's, you know, that's not a problem that we may even have to deal with directly. And so, you know, with that being said, yeah, I guess our conclusion is remember to preference Labour in both the Senate and the House. And when I say preference them, it doesn't necessarily mean,
it doesn't mean
your
your
first
vote
preference
goes to them. It just means that, you know, make sure they're ahead of the worst options.
Yeah, like in the Senate, you need to do, I think it's 6 above the line at a minimum, or 12 below the line. But, you know, most people don't do below the line, and I wouldn't suggest doing below the line either, because your vote is very likely to exhaust, which means it counts for nothing if it exhausts. So, you know, voting above the line, yeah, I'd say, you know, I mean, don't, like in the Senate, don't bother putting the Liberals and Nationals, you know, or even like One Nation or anything like that, or especially Trumpeter Patriots.
Or Libertarian.
You know, yeah, I don't know too much about Libertarian Party here in Australia, but I'll say this: do at least, if you're not gonna like, as long as you don't preference them at any point, if you do at least make one of your last few preferences the Labor Party, then no matter what, even if your other candidates don't win, you still at least get a say in who governs, and that, you know, they're a solid option. You know, they're Like,
They're nothing
know-
fancy, but they're dependable.
yes, and same for the House of Representatives, your local candidate. Like as I said, my first preference isn't going to be the Labor Party, but in the House of Reps, my local candidate, they're going to be my fourth preference. And then,
Yep.
yeah,
Okay.
and so
We're at time
Um,
zero. We'll catch you later,
yeah.
James. Thank you for coming along.
See you guys. Don't vote for Dutton.
all right, good talking with you, James. Good talking with your horse, and hope you enjoyed this election super podcast 2025
Thing.
show, whatever it was called.
This thing.
Have a good one. Yes, this thing that we have done. All right,
Take care.
take care.